Why don't we start? I am Thomas Slicer. I'm a board secretary of the American German Business Club. I'm the fellow that puts on various events, most of which have become Zoom conference calls, as is this one, since we can no longer meet in public. Uh, Today is the Ides of March. A day made famous in 44 BC by Julius Caesar with the help of Cassius, Brutus, Mark Antony, and somewhat later William Shakespeare. And as we are in the midst of another viral pandemic where many are cautioning beware, perhaps the beware the Ides of March is an appropriate comment. As you may know, Caesar, who had heard the beware moniker for some days beforehand, reported to the soothsayer on entering the Senate, the Ides are here. And the soothsayer's response was, but not yet gone. So with that, we will receive information on what might be the outlook for this current viral pandemic. Will COVID-19 be like other pandemics where many of the population expired, but life ultimately continued? For example, in 1918, 1919, some estimate up to 50 million people perished. Or another question is, are we here in Germany now entering a third wave of infections? Are the vaccines working to reduce these infections? And what else might we do to better our future? Enlightening us today in these important questions are two worldwide experts in COVID-19 research, vaccination, and treatment. We have Professor Dr. Peter J. Hotez, who is the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. He is also co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development and endowed chair in tropical pediatrics. A vaccine he helped develop is now undergoing testing in India, I understand. Professor Hotez received his undergraduate degree from Yale University, magna cum laude, and his MD and PhD from Weill Cornell Medical College and Rockefeller University. As noted in our invitation, he is a prolific author, has received many honorary awards, is a frequent commentator on television, and even today appeared on CNN, rescheduling his appearance to accommodate us in Germany. We thank you very much for that, Professor Hotez. Professor Dr. Elena Battazzi, PhD, is an Associate Dean of Baylor College of Medicine. She graduated from the University of Honduras, the University of Florida, the University of Miami, and the University of Pennsylvania. As does Professor Hotez, Professor Battazzi has numerous scholarly publications. She is co-chair of the New Vaccines and Therapeutics Task Force of the Lancet Commission on COVID-19, and Forbes magazine selected her as one of the 100 most powerful women in Central America. In the way of comment, we will entertain questions after this presentation. However, we ask that you send them to us via the chat function on Zoom. Now, with these introductions, which due to the immense size that they really are, have been abbreviated, may I turn the conference over to Professors Hotez and Battazzi with a thought that we in Germany are very concerned about press reports of a potential third wave surge in the infections here. With that, I withdraw from the stage, so to speak, in deference to our two guests.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Peter, can you start us off, and then maybe we can all
Sure.
tag team.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking, what we're seeing now are varied patterns in different parts of the world. In the United States, we are seeing some pretty steep declines in the number of new cases a day. We've gone from 250,000 new confirmed cases a day in January down to around 50,000 new cases a day confirmed. But remember, that's an underestimate, probably by a factor of 3 or 4. So it's still quite a high level of transmission. And unfortunately, what's happening in the U.S. is many governors are already declaring victory. Mission accomplished, they're saying, is because we're starting to vaccinate the American people and the cases have come down a lot. And what I'm countering is that we still have a pretty high level of transmission, even though we're about 50,000 new cases a day confirmed. That's about the same alarming rate that we saw last summer when we were all wringing our hands. And I think we've lost sight of that. And then we have other factors that we have to worry about, including the rise of the variants. And what's the thinking in the U.S. side is that it's the B.1.1.7 variant that arose out of the United Kingdom back in September that's accelerating the most. And now there's pretty firm evidence that there's higher levels of transmission associated with the B.1.1.7 variant, higher mortality. And unfortunately, we've not gone very far with vaccinations, really. We've vaccinated about 20% of the United States, including about 25% of the adult population, has received a single dose of either the mRNA vaccines or the J&J vaccine, which is still quite modest. And some states are performing better than others. So New Mexico is near the top of the list at about 30%. Texas is about half that at 15%. So we're underachieving because we've never really recovered from that last week when we had the collapse of the power grid. And now, unfortunately, we have the B.1.1.7 variant in high numbers in certain states. So in Texas, Georgia, and Florida, about half the virus isolates are the B.1.1.7 variant. The numbers still have not come up, but we're all waiting for it because we think the situation should be similar to what we've seen in what we've seen in the UK. Yet many of the governors are now releasing restrictions on masks and social distancing, and many of us in the scientific community feel that's premature, that we should at least hold off another month to see what's going to happen with the variant from the UK and have a higher percentage of the U.S. population vaccinated. I think if we had waited, we could wait another month or 6 weeks, we could easily double the percentage of the U.S. population that's vaccinated both with single doses and 2 doses. So the good news on the U.S. side is we have now procured all the vaccine that we need for the United States for both good reasons and bad reasons. And I think we will be able to vaccinate our way out of this pandemic, because we're now, based on studies from Israel, are showing that the vaccines not only interrupt symptomatic illness, which is something we knew from the phase 3 trials, but is also halting asymptomatic infection. So it's actually stopping virus shedding. So that's really exciting news. So I think there's a lot of optimism for the U.S. as we head into the summer. In Europe, there are some similarities but differences as well. That variant from the UK, the B.1.1.7, seems to be accelerating now in a very scary way, both in Western Europe and in Central Europe. And there's still not sufficient doses of vaccine for many countries. For instance, so far there's not an adequate amount of the 2 mRNA vaccines being accelerated. Same with the J&J vaccine. And now we're seeing many countries actually slow or halt release of the AstraZeneca vaccine after the EMA, the European Medicine Agency, the regulatory body, authorized its release. And the reasons that they've slowed it is because even there's been about 17 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine released in the European Union and the UK. And they've had dozens of cases of clotting disorders, either deep venous thromboses or pulmonary emboli or thrombocytopenia. I think many of us in the scientific community feel that these blood clotting disorders are not unusual when you're examining thousands and thousands of people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. These are things that happen with some frequency. And many of us in the scientific community feel the frequency of those clotting disorders is no higher in the vaccination group than you might expect ordinarily. And some have even said it's less. Yet it's given the regulatory agencies some pause for concern, particularly because they are new technologies. So people tend to be conservative. But given how much B117 is accelerating, I worry about pausing vaccinations. This is not the time to do it because we're going to lose lives from COVID-19. And I more or less just said that an hour ago on CNN International. Let's hope it resonates. In Latin America, we have a different problem with a steep rise in cases also like in Europe, but at least in Brazil, that's due to a particular Brazilian variant called P1. And that one is more problematic because whereas all the vaccines work against the UK strain equally well, many of the vaccines do not work against the South African strain and may not work against the Brazilian strain very well or only partially. So I'm quite worried about Latin America. I'm worried about Africa as those two particular spike variants, the South African and Brazil, really accelerate. So that's kind of the 30,000 foot level aerial view. And Mary Elena, maybe you want to say a few words and
Yes,
also
certainly.
about the vaccine that we're accelerating, and then we can answer questions.
Yes, absolutely. And I think maybe to complement what Peter said, well, first of all, thanks so much certainly to Thomas for this opportunity to speak into all of you, and we look forward to your questions. But it's also quite challenging to really establish the impact of the various variants of concern that are circulating around in context of what is real life impact, meaning many of the experiments that we're currently doing, of course, are in the laboratory. That already gives us a hint that there's going to be variability in how antibodies or responses raised against the virus or the vaccine is going to impact protection. But at the same time, protection at this point is symptomatic protection or clinical symptoms. And so we need to also be very careful because, it might be that we still can achieve protection against very severe clinical symptoms as well as deaths, but maybe not as much on moderate or not that severe symptoms. And that's a problem because then it gives the opportunity for this virus to continue mutating. And that's the reason why we believe, independent of what happens with the modifications that this virus is going to have in the future, is the need of why we need to ramp up the number of coverage of vaccinees around the world. And on that note, I have to say that working with the commission, and Peter is also co-chair of that Lancet Commission with myself, it's that you heard him saying that most of the high-income countries have secured vaccines. Most of the high-income countries clearly have started vaccination campaigns, but many countries have not. And therefore, we're never going to be able to catch up if some countries reach the 2/3 of the population being vaccinated, while other countries barely even get their initial attempt of the COVAX distribution, which is less than 20% of its population. So we really have a very big disconnect. And even though it was initially approached with an attempt with not having a two-tier system, it is always the fact that, the low middle income countries end up not having access or not having the ability of equitably distribute these vaccines. So we can certainly go more into that and the kinds of things that we certainly are interested in supporting and advancing. Just some initial words about our vaccine center. So with Peter, we have been working together for 2 decades now. We started with a concept that our center would dedicate itself to not only develop, discover, and advance vaccines for diseases that are considered the neglected tropical diseases. So a lot of diseases that clearly afflict many people around the world, but mostly poor people around the world. And for the last 10 years, we actually started a program specifically on coronavirus vaccines. And I think that's very important, because when you hear that these vaccines have been developed so quickly, in real honesty, it hasn't been so quick. We have been actually working on them for more than a decade. And in true, maybe for COVID-19 specifically, it's recent, but the learnings that we already had for SARS and MERS and even other coronavirus studies really spearheaded it and really were catalysts for being able for us to advance the vaccine. So our center for the last decade, in fact, has been evaluating which would be a suitable, what we call target for a vaccine. We even went a little bit differently from maybe many of the other groups, is that we focus on very traditional technologies, meaning technologies to make vaccines that we know have been licensed before, that have had safety evidence because they've been used widely in context of other diseases. For example, our platform is the same that we use for the hepatitis B vaccine. But I think most importantly that we would have access to scalability and manufacturing capacity, not only in high income countries, but in many low and middle income countries. And I think that's hopefully one of the values that we want to bring, is that vaccines that use these traditional technologies in the context of pandemics should be looked at as priorities, together with certainly, vaccines that are made with these innovative new technologies. But I think one of the probably mistakes that the global community did was to assume that this pandemic was not going to become such an enormity and global, and that we were going to be able to very quickly address it with the so-called fast and novel technologies. And they realized very late in the game that they would never reach the amounts needed, nor the challenges of distribution that now we see with vaccines such as, the RNA technology, as well as some of the viral vector technologies. So I think at least we know in our vaccine center, we have always had that view of we appreciate novel technologies. We certainly also ourselves develop some to understand how they compare. But when we come to the decision of what is those that are most suitable, we never forget that sometimes it's as easy as taking technologies that people already have wide experience with. Even populations that use them have had experience in using them. And so maybe that would allow to also disrupt a little bit the vaccine hesitancy. So we're hopeful that probably during the summer, we're going to start seeing indeed now second generation vaccines that probably also incorporate these traditional technologies. And as examples, we could even say, boosting the ones that already are being distributed or available, but at the same time, probably expand pediatric vaccine formulations, and maybe even replace, in some cases, some of the vaccine strategies that we currently see. So I'm going to maybe pause there, Thomas, and maybe send it back to you and see if you want another overarching question before we open it for the Q&A.
Thank you very much for that update. I have a question for you and Dr. Hotez. You all have developed some vaccines at the Center for Vaccine Development, and are they different than what's being promulgated at the moment for current vaccinations, or well, what are the differences, may we ask?
So maybe I'll start, and then Peter, you can complement. So we focus on what's called protein-based type of vaccines, or recombinant subunit vaccines. And again, as an example, these are technologies that have been widely used in licensed vaccines previously. For example, hepatitis B, human papillomavirus vaccines, they're all made using this concept of recombinant subunit vaccines. We specifically use the production system that uses yeast. There's many production systems of how you can make protein vaccines, but the yeast system is also very widely understood. Indeed, it's also the same as it's the one that's used for hepatitis B. And specifically, for example, if we go to where these vaccines can be produced, we know that, for example, India is a perfect example. As you know, India has probably one of the largest vaccine manufacturing ecosystems globally. In fact, India probably now is the producer of most of the vaccines around the world, especially vaccines for the low middle income countries, including India themselves. And therefore for us was almost a no-brainer that when we decided to advance the COVID-19 vaccine, again, using a novel piece of the coronavirus, in this case, a COVID-19 little piece of the spike protein, embedded it into the same way as we produce the hepatitis B, and then immediately we're able to transition it to a company in India called Biological E, who now, in fact, we know that they have been able to take our processes and they can make 1.2 billion doses of this protein annually. And they already had experience that, it took us less than 3 months to be able to transition this to them. So I think that's a little bit the distinction of our vaccine center, is that we ahead of time understand who we are going to be doing the handoff to, that this handoff has to be done in a way that can be replicated, scaled, but at the same time affordable. For example, hepatitis B vaccines cost pennies on the dollar. And now we know that Biological E, for example, when they committed to getting to this COVID-19 vaccine development, they are going to ensure that these vaccines are going to be less than, I think now they're less than $1.50 a dose. Which goes very much aligned with the accessibility and affordability, even in the long run, so sustainable affordability. And of course, they have already had even experience with highly stringent regulatory bodies. Their hepatitis B vaccine, for example, has received a World Health Organization pre-qualification. And so that's the kind of things that we ensure we look for before we advance our vaccines that we develop in our center. Peter, any other words on that front? You're on mute, Peter.
Yeah, that's right. So it would be nice to see if this recombinant protein could also come into Europe at some point, and North America. We think it's going to find a lot of use in low and middle income countries because you can make a lot of it and it's inexpensive and easy to scale and administer. So that's the big priority for us. But we also think it could be widely accepted in Europe as well, especially as a pediatric vaccine, as Mary Elena points out, because it's an old established technology.
Okay, I have in this call is Dr. Howard Ernovitz, who has some experience in RNA research, and he tells me he has a couple of questions. Howard, if you unmute, would you ask what you want to ask?
Yes. Thanks so much for appearing to the American German Business Club. Professor Batazzi, my heart is warmed to hear you're doing a protein vaccine. What my question is how are you going to deliver it? In other words, my background is I did a FDA study, 26,000 people looking at HIV patients, and we found that a number of our false positives turned out that they were IgA antibodies to HIV-1 and they were seronegative. And we never had the chance to follow up on those were the natural immune patients we should have been studying. I did send them to Gene Scher and Mago Kurichi at NIH, and they did verify they'd been exposed to HIV. So my question is, would the 1-2 punch be a protein? Because I worry about retrocopying of RNA. That's what I do. And but is there a way that you could also ensure both an IgA and IgG response by, I don't know, being clever of doing an intramuscular and then a follow up with an intranasal so that you can get good secretory IgA and IgG1? And that's my question. Thank you.
Yes, and you bring up a really very important point. And in fact, you're right. So our approach right now, the initial approach has been, of course, that traditional intramuscular pathway. And in fact, Biological E is developing a formulation which is a protein on an aluminum hydroxide, which is the traditional, I guess, hepatitis B. But now they also join forces with Dynavax, which in fact is the same as the hepatitis B approach. Now there is a hepatitis B protein on alum with the Dynavax oligodeoxynucleotide, the CpG. So practically it's the same type of formulation, mostly because, as you know, when you add these immunostimulants, you also balance a little bit better, certainly the not only the humoral response, but the cellular responses. Interestingly, however, we appreciate that you're right, for even future, probably even boosting or even just additional generations of vaccines, we're looking at oral deliveries, intranasal deliveries. And I have to tell you, we've actually been working with a very interesting partnership with a group in Israel, where we're actually evaluating, in fact, our recombinant protein in context of a platform proprietary formulation that they have, where they're going to be doing intranasal and oral stimulations. And in fact, even in our labs, as you know, we don't only do very advanced, we also do like preclinical research, and we're starting to do these studies. The other thing that I may add is that we're also doing studies in this concept of priming and boosting, right? So if you already got an RNA vaccine, I believe, and I think Peter does too, that the ideal strategy is you come later and you boost with a protein. In fact, viral vector vaccines, and we have an issue with adenoviruses, if you need to immunize people often, you cannot boost with adenovirus too close between time. So you're going to have to come up with something else. And in fact, adenoviruses were studied, all the years that they have been studied, they've always been studied in concept of priming and boosting, always priming with a viral vector, boosting with a protein. So I have to say that protein-based vaccines are probably going to eventually come and likely even replace at some level, because not only they're easier to be made, they're safer, they can boost this concept of memory, and at the same time, they're cheaper, right? You don't have to deal with all these cold chain management and all that, other challenges.
And just as a follow-up, that I'm elated to hear this. Just as a follow-up, are there any natural adjuvants that you can also combine with these just to give yourself that extra, make sure you get that extra boost? And then also to ask the question, what does natural immunity look like? Actually, just a full disclosure, I've got samples being sequenced right now. We're looking at people that have naturally recovered from COVID-19 and people that were vaccinated. And we're just simply doing RNA-seq analysis. And then we're just going to subtract A from B and ask the question, what are we missing in vaccinations that natural immunity people have? And then use that as medical intelligence to go forward. And my guess is, if I had to come up with a hypothesis, is we need some kind of natural adjuvants to help us, something that the body may supply or whatever, even if it's an interferon or an interleukin or something like that. So Those are my two.
Yes, and I think you're right. I mean, formulation science is going to be very important, and like you said, where you obtain that added immunostimulation or guiding vaccine immunity, of course, to supersede natural immunity. That's the whole point, right? I think that we also are, in fact, we're also looking at other very interesting TLR7/8 type of adjuvants, not only the arm of the CpGs. As you know, for example, that India vaccine that was developed by Bharat, the whole virus inactivated with alum, has a TLR7/8. And in fact, our own studies, shortly we're going to be publishing one of our non-human primate studies where we showed that, our vaccine with that type of immune stimulants also pretty much have an enormous ability of boosting protection and certainly response. So you're right. And as a side note, for example, adenoviruses themselves can provide adjuvanticity themselves. So I think it's going to be very interesting also what it looks like when you have a backbone of having an adeno-based vaccination on top of a protein-based vaccination. You're welcome.
We have several less technical questions. One gentleman from Middle Hessen is curious about what are the future trends? Are we going to have to put up with this type of phenomenon forever, or how are we eventually going to bring this down to a low level like we have with the normal flu, or what do we think the future is?
Well, my hope is that, we are seeing a certain convergence among these spike variants. It always seems to come back to the same couple of mutations in the spike protein or its receptor binding domain. So my hope is that once we get people vaccinated with the original strains and then make a boost to the variant from South Africa / Brazil, that we might be out of this, at least for a while, depending on the durability of protection for these vaccines. So with influenza, it's a different story. It's a brand new virus every year, and so you have to move. It's a very carefully orchestrated dance to make a brand new vaccine. With this, the hope is you wouldn't have to do that, but we don't, because it's a brand new technology, we don't know the durability of protection. So therefore, other boosts may be required. So we'll see. I do think we'll probably move to a third dose of the Moderna or Pfizer RNA vaccines in order to accommodate the variant. I do think we may need to go to a second dose of the J&J vaccine. I think for the AstraZeneca vaccine, we'll have to give a boost, although it probably won't be an adenovirus, maybe a protein boost. And then we sit tight and hope that we might be out of this, but we can't say for certain.
And what are thoughts on the various vaccines? I know here there's controversy, as we all know, about the AstraZeneca. We also have a vaccine that's being offered from Russia, the Sputnik vaccine, and the Chinese seem to want to push some of theirs as well. Can we comment on?
I think the AstraZeneca vaccine is a good vaccine, and I see on the chat already that Germany is now withdrawing it or going to pause it because of the clotting issue. I'm not convinced that's justified at this point, given how, life is all about risk versus benefit, and we know the risk of not getting vaccinated, given what's happening with COVID-19 right now in this UK variant. Unless they know something I don't, which is quite possible, I think I would have not have halted that vaccine at this point, but we'll see. I think that's a mistake. And also, I'm not that enthusiastic in general about the Russian vaccines and two of the Chinese vaccines, the Sinovac and CanSino Bio, because the level of virus neutralizing antibody they induce is quite low. I don't think it'll do well against a number of the variants, and so far they've not gone through the World Health Organization pre-qualification mechanisms. So I just don't have a sense of their quality control and quality assurance. What I've been saying to people, because oftentimes, especially with some of the big US international companies, like the oil and gas companies here in Houston, I get a number of calls from employees who are overseas, and they say, look, doc, that's all I can get. It's either take it or leave it with the Russian vaccine. And I've been saying take it, because at least we know you'll get some virus neutralizing antibodies. That wouldn't be my first choice, but at least it can prevent you from going to the hospital or the ICU.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate that we're in that kind of situation, that we don't have more widely accessible, simpler vaccines like what we're proposing to do, but that is the reality.
But I think, Peter, you pretty much highlighted. I think right now the urgency is to get a vaccine that would really permit you to not, if you get infected, go into very severe symptomatic disease that takes you to the hospital, and of course, the potential of death. And at least the benefit that we're seeing certainly outweighs any risks. Of course, you have to, of course, also talk to your own physician, of course, depending on your own, risk factors and whatnot. But Peter is right. I mean, these are still experimental vaccines. I mean, the fact that they have received authorization doesn't mean that they are fully licensed. So even those that are being authorized, they are still under experimentation. So the companies are still in the binding that they need to continue advancing the clinical trial strategy. But Peter is right. There are the stringent regulatory bodies, and then there's those that are affiliated through the international harmonization guidelines, and then there's those who actually have bilateral binding agreements with these national regulatory agencies. And so usually what I look is who gave the authorizations and under which regulatory entity. That doesn't mean the other regulatory entities are not good, but they're not as experienced as the stringent ones. So if you see something that's been approved by Health Canada, by UK, MHRA, by EMEA, by Japan, by US, those are like the super stringent ones, and usually the more strict. So and the others, you have to look, and so it's a balance. However, Peter is right. I'm from Honduras. Honduras right now are only going to get AstraZeneca and Sputnik. And what are you going to do? I mean, people are dying, so might as well just get what you can get. Ultimately, I think they are going to be effective. But as Peter said, we don't know how long or how good for some of the variants. But if we start thinking about waiting until something better comes, we're just never going to be able to squash this virus. So I think we should, all take a decision on the basis of what the need that this is really a benefit right now.
Are there special precautions one should take for expecting women, as an example?
Yes, and in that front, I have to say we've been working very closely. As you know, we're in a children's hospital, which also now children's hospitals actually take care of the women. So, so we've been working very closely with the OBGYN groups and also all the associations and committees that look at that. And to be quite honest, the risk to the mother and the risk to the unborn baby is so high because they are at higher risk of severe disease that the recommendations are, they should not be certainly treated as differently as, a non-pregnant woman. And so again, with consultation with the doctor, it is not contraindicated, but it's actually very highly encouraged. That pregnant
Das ist
women.
auch so ein Professor.
We have on the line Peter Renders, who's does some work at Merck in this line, and he had had a couple comments that perhaps you would share with us, Peter.
Sure. I'm working actually for the worldwide Merck, not the US Merck.
Mm-hmm.
And we are heavily involved in the formulation business and work together with about 50 vaccine programs. And I'm very happy that you underlined the importance of the protein and the lipid cages around the vaccines and how important they are. But my concern is more on the basic principles. We have, and it's not a surprise, a very variable virus with mutants, and these mutants will not stop to mutate. So are the mRNA vaccines better in adapting to these variants? And of course, I also see positive points for the classical. So what's your view on the pro and cons here?
Yeah, I think, each vaccine technology has its advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages of the mRNA technology is you can make a piece of mRNA quickly, and certainly with these new variants, you can make a piece of mRNA corresponding to whatever one you want, South Africa or Brazil. We also have an mRNA program in our lab. The disadvantage is the technology is still new for scale up. So in terms of packaging and producing it at scale and stabilizing it at room temperature, refrigerator temperatures, we're not there yet. So this is why, ultimately, I think the technology has a lot of promise moving forward in future years. And this may become a dominant vaccine technology, say 5 years from now, but not now. And that's the big issue. So yes, downstream, I think it offers enormous promise, but you're seeing the difficulties in providing these vaccines at scale. I mean, Pfizer kindly sent 230,000 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine to Rwanda. It's a nice one-off thing, but look at the problem of Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is 1.1 billion people. Two doses of many of the vaccines. It's 2 billion immunizations. Sending 230,000 doses is great, but it's a drop in the bucket, as they say. So we're going to have to figure out how to balance the urgency for innovation. And both Mary Lane and I we have our doctoral degrees in science, and we love innovation. We're doing it ourselves, and yet we never. I sometimes think the policymakers went a little too far in the realm of innovation and didn't give enough attention to balancing that portfolio with some simple, durable vaccines like the one we're doing, and hopefully things will even out, and we can get ahead of these variants as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. And by the way, we do a lot of things with the global Merck.
In fact, many.
We've worked with the CEO, and they've helped us with some of even though the global Merck is not a vaccine company, they've helped us because they are also linked with Millipore and Sigma, that they've helped us with some of our manufacturing processes for a schistosomiasis vaccine for Africa, which we're very grateful for.
Yes, in fact,
Millipore and Sigma are actually now part of the global Merck, so we have acquired them and spent quite a lot of money for them.
Yes. Right. So we've been partnering with them, and we worked a lot with what was his name, Udit Batra, but he's left now, right? Hasn't he? Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. And on that note, I just also want to add that you're right, but clearly, for example, ourselves, we now already do have our prototype for the, let's call it South African/Brazil variant cell bank. Already kind of transferred it over to, certainly to Biological E, because they're already preempting, right? The need to, even in their own strategy, they may come in with even a third boost, using a variant version. So true, creating a cell bank of a protein based, it's not as fast as creating one for RNA, but I think everybody has to, as Peter said, kind of at some point balance that.
Okay, I understand you all have another important meeting to go to. Can we end with one or two questions from our people? I have one, and it relates specifically to my home of Texas, where you all, and uh, how do you think the progress of this infection is going to go now that you can run around with masks and you know, go hooting and hollering and wearing your cowboy boots everywhere and dancing with people and not maintaining distance? Is that going to be totally counterproductive, or are we vaccinating enough people it'll counteract that? You know, what's the real the thinking?
I mean, I think when everyone's fully vaccinated, life, I don't want to say it'll get completely back to normal, but we'll clearly be in a much better position. We'll have to see how that Brazil and South African variant performs. But I think, once we're fully vaccinated, we know we can halt transmission, at least with the original and the UK variants. And then we'll see, and hopefully the boosters will take care of it. So I don't want to say we'll get completely back to normal, but clearly, I think, if the issue is getting back to see a UT or Texas A&M football game, or I think that's possible. I don't think anybody's going to want to watch the Houston Texans this fall, as we seem to be trading away the whole team. But
Yeah,
that's a different story.
well, I just like to go see my mother, who's 99,
Yeah.
in a nursing home, and I can't even approach the property. So, and on top of that, I'm not particularly enamored with traveling from Germany to Texas and then getting trapped there because you've been to a hot spot. So,
Well, I think once you're vaccinated, I took my first plane ride in a year last weekend because I hadn't seen my two oldest adult kids in 14 months, and my wife was just getting too depressed. So we got, and I have a daughter in LA and a son in Tucson. We met in Tucson, and I can't say flying was fun. I mean, you sit there for 2 hours. It wasn't a long flight; it was a 2-hour flight, but on a mask for 2 hours on the plane. Let's face it, flying was no real treat to begin with over the last few years, and then you had the mask and everything else. It's not an enjoyable experience, but it's a necessary one.
yeah. Okay, let me be polite. Thank you all very, very much for taking time from your busy schedule to talk to the American German community in Germany. We very much appreciate it. I know you have another important event to go to, and from the bottom of our hearts, thank you, Dr. Hotez. Thank you, Dr. Bottazi, for taking this time. Douglas, thank you for being the technical guru.
Well, thank you very much. We've done a lot of work with German institutions and in Tübingen and Hamburg, and of course Mark and Darmstadt, and looking forward to the day when we can visit again.
Well, you're always welcome here, and please let us know. Frankfurt's sort of the heart of it. If you come to Germany, you almost by default have to
all roads go through Frankfurt, so we know it well.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you very much. And from my side, I just want to say that, I know that at some level, we're all very privileged, for not only, where we live and, having access to, just in general, right? Access to a lot of health opportunities. And there's so many, certainly, people as well as areas of the world. And when I was reading the chat, in fact, these decisions of pausing or stopping without a real good communication strategy behind it's really tough, because again, if right now, for example, Honduras will be receiving these AstraZeneca vaccines, and that's probably going to be pretty much the almost only choice. And so seeing that there's all these countries in Europe, stopping and pausing or doing whatever, it's really amazing how it just neglects how it's perceived or even how should it be communicated. And the reality is that, we're not going to be able to solve our own problems if we also do not solve the problems of those countries that are actually going to be not being able to get out of this pandemic anytime soon, right? So it's going to be very impossible, even economically, to keep all these borders and globalization, interactions. If we have regions where you barely have vaccines, and on top of it, you have hesitance on vaccines, or vaccines are not being used because of the disconnect in communication. So I know Peter is very animate about that, but it's a very tough aspect to address when you're hearing these crazy discussions on one side of the world, while at the same time you're saying, but by the way, all these vaccines are the only ones that we're going to be sending to the low middle income countries. So it's kind of gives a very bad message, and we're going to have to deal with that. And I personally, I'm very worried because I don't know what to tell people, right? Scientifically, I can have attempt to explain to them the unlikeliness that these AstraZeneca, for example, vaccines are really the causative of these blood clotting events. But 30 cases, being certainly dramatized in the media, it's pretty much causing some enormous hesitance in countries that's the only choice that they're going to be getting in the time soon. So if you all can have a little bit of a contribution, is try to raise awareness, point people to the scientific, trustworthy information, and let's try not to add to the disinformation by certainly talking about things that maybe are not received in the right context. So I appreciate, Thomas, the opportunity.
Okay. Well, my
Bye-bye.
father is an example.
Thank you again.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, and good luck on your next call.
Many
Wonderful.
thanks. Thank you again.
Thank you,
I appreciate
everybody.
the
Our
opportunity.
pleasure. Bye-bye.